All right, I think we can get started. Now, the reason I wanted to share this particular topic with you guys is I think it's something that people struggle with from a photographic point of view quite a lot. You know, it's and this actually came up around about, it was last year, around about this time actually, when I was hosting a client of mine, Kim, on a private guided safari, and we did Mana Pools and Wangi and Madikwe. And she was new to wildlife photography. And as you guys know, when you start off with wildlife photography, there's a lot of things to keep in mind. You know, it's so much going on. You hear all these technical terms when it comes to photography. So I just basically wanted to simplify this a little bit for you, and just to make it a little bit easier to remember the basics in photography. And I've broken it down into a mode that I call safe mode. Now, if you're looking for this on your camera, you won't find it. It's more just something to keep in mind, to almost like a sort of stepping stone, a stepping process almost to go through to help you with your photography. And I can guarantee you, if you stick to these rules, you're not going to go wrong from a photographic point of view. Okay. So let's get straight into it. Sorry, I just want to move this aside quickly. And there we go. Another one. Okay, I think we good to go. All right, so I've broken it down into 4 words. So safe mode, the S, I've used it for shutter speed, the A for aperture, F for focus, and then E for exposure compensation. And I will keep it in this order. And this is sort of what goes through my mind from a photographic point of view, but also really, really helped me from a teaching point of view to Kim at that stage. And I'm sure it's going to help you guys to, if you follow this process, as I mentioned, your photography, not much will go wrong if you follow these steps. Okay, so shutter speed. Now, for me, the first thing when I look at a particular scene, and it could be any scene, it could be whether you're doing landscapes or an animal sitting down, or even photographing an action scene, is to firstly look at what your shutter speed is. That's the most important part. And the important part for you as the photographer to decide what you want to do with your image. Remember, if you followed my webinar a few days ago where I broke down the triangle of light, you will remember that shutter speed, that basically freezes or creates movement in your frame. Now, for the majority of the time, you probably want to freeze the image. And to be able to do that, you need a fast enough shutter speed. So everything else can be perfect, but if your shutter speed is not fast enough, you're going to have a blurred image, you're going to have movement in your frame. I'll be showing you guys a few examples. So just to show you on your camera, that's where you could find the shutter speeds. Usually the top left, if you look through the viewfinder, the bottom left of your frame. Okay, so nice action scene. You can see I put the shutter speed down at the bottom here. A shutter speed of 3,200. So at that particular speed, you're going to freeze most of the movement. You can see in the feet of the lion, the head, everything is sharp and it's in focus, and the movement is frozen. With shutter speed, you had to be a little bit slow. Maybe if you were like less than focal range. For those of you that don't understand what I mean by that, as a rule of thumb, we say that your shutter speed should be equivalent to your focal length. Okay, so if you're using a 600mm lens, your shutter speed shouldn't be below 600. If you're using a 400mm lens, then 1/400 as a shutter speed. That is just a rule of thumb, but obviously when you have action scenes like this, you need to be a little bit faster with your shutter speed, as I've shown you at the bottom here. Okay, again, lioness drinking like a sort of late afternoon, beautiful golden light. You want to have a fast shutter speed just to freeze the movement of the tongue. It's not moving as fast as the previous scene, so the shutter speed doesn't have to be like 4,000 or so, but anything sort of over that 800 to 1,000 mark is going to freeze most situations. Okay, again, beautiful action scene, not always easy to witness, but something that it is nature, and it is part of what happens out there. You want to capture this with a fast shutter speed. So all of your other settings, your ISO and your aperture, basically have to sort of compromise the fact that you want a fast shutter speed, if that makes sense. Now, a lot of the time, and I spoke about this in my previous webinar as well, a lot of the time people worry about shooting high ISOs because of the grain that you might get. In a situation like this, it's either having a fast shutter speed and sort of being able to capture the frame, or then having a bit of noise in the image. In this particular case, a bit of noise, that's a sort of the price I'm willing to pay to be able to capture an image like this, if that makes sense. Okay, so shutter speed, very, very important. You can then also use your shutter speed as a creative tool, and I encourage people a lot on Safari to do stuff like this, you know, especially if you've been photographing wildlife for quite a while. You know, the more you travel to Africa and the more you go on safaris, the more you sort of bank certain images. So if you've got maybe 100 or 200 images of rhinos, then why go and create the same thing over and over again? So I really encourage my guests to then use the slow shutter speeds, use the panning modes, and by doing that, you're really creating something different, something arty, something unique. And the great thing about what I really love about these panning shots is not one, like no two images are exactly the same, if that makes sense. You know, whereas if you photograph rhinos or leopard, whatever it may be, it's so hard to almost to stand out because they've been photographed in so many different ways. And yes, for sure, you have to get like your sort of banking images first. But then after you've done that, why not try and get a little bit creative and do something like this? Very slow shutter speed. This, as you can see, it's 1/8 of a second. So very, very slow. And the idea behind this is that you want to get that face and the body in focus and get that movement of the legs. Okay, same thing with the leopard. This was in the Masai Mara last year, November. And Linda, if I'm not mistaken, I think you were there, if I'm not mistaken. But this particular leopard, you know, we've been photographing her for quite a number of hours. So instead of, you know, spending 2, 3, 4 hours with a particular animal and just creating the same image over and over again, this gives you a great opportunity to get really creative with your shutter speed and go slow. This is even like 1/4 of a second. So go very slow, and the slower you go, the higher the risk that it might go wrong, but the reward is also so much higher. And it's also important to notice that, you know, in a particular scene like this, not every single image is going to work out, all right? So don't beat yourself up. If you might take 100 images and, you know, if 2 or 3 of them come off, then you've done pretty well. Okay, this is an elephant in at Somalisa camp in Wangi. Beautiful place where they come and drink right in front of the lodge. There's a little water hole there. And you can see my shutter speed here was open for 5 seconds. And the reason for that being is just to try and capture some of that sky as well. You can see the movement of the trunk. It gives like a sort of ghostly effect. But I really enjoy this kind of photography. It gives your sort of own creative spin on it. It's a little bit artistic. And it also, you know, it tests your skill quite a bit. And obviously the reason for this being like so slow, as I mentioned, to try and get some of that sky, but it was obviously very dark as well. So your shutter had to stay open a bit longer to capture all of that information. And yeah, in this particular case, you just hope that the elephant or your subject doesn't move around too much, right? If this elephant had to walk around or run, then it would be a bit of a mess. So you do rely a bit on your subjects as well. Okay, then the A, I've broken down to aperture, as I mentioned, and just to show you guys where to get that on your camera. So the second thing, once I present it with the scene and I look at it, I'm happy with my shutter speed. I then think about what I would like to do from a depth of field point of view. What I want, do I want to isolate my subject from the background? Do I want to include more of the background? Or do I want to have multiple subjects in focus? So that's the second sort of process that goes through before taking the image. My shutter speed is ready. I then sort of move on to my aperture and see what I would like to create. So a lot of the time with wildlife, you are dealing with a lot of distracting elements, right? So it could be grass, it could be the head of another lion, as you can see, another cub at the back. So you often have a lot of distracting elements, and the majority of the time you can't sort of exactly just sort of move and get that distracting element out of your frame. So by using a shallow depth of field, you can really create some interesting effects. So this was with a 600mm lens, and that's also something to take note of, that your focal range is also going to influence your depth of field. So if I had to photograph this at about 200 or 300 mils, then the shallow depth of field probably wouldn't have been the same as with the 600. Okay, so shallow depth of field, personally, I absolutely love it. It is higher risk, but the rewards are absolutely phenomenal. And this really gives you the opportunity to get really, really creative. So this particular image, a pangolin in Tswalu Game Reserve, and I think we were about 4 or 5 photographers with this particular scene. And the great thing, what I love about the aperture and depth of field, is every single person sees it differently. So my take on it was, I really wanted to get this the scales sharp and in focus, but then also that tail of the pangolin that you can see at the back, I wanted that to sort of blur out a little bit. Again, every photographer will have a different take on this. You could have gotten a different result. Maybe if you shot at like f10, f11, get more of that tail in focus. But it's up to you from a sort of creativity point of view, what it is you'd like to achieve. And that's what I really love about being with sort of photographers and like-minded people. Okay, also your distance that you are from your subject, that also plays a massive part when it comes to your depth of field, and something that you have to pay close attention to. So this is my my little puppy dog, Rottweiler, and you can see even in this frame, I was shooting at f8. I mean, she was very close to me, so I was using a macro lens, and I was focusing on the nose, obviously. So again, from a creativity point of view, you can do it in like many different ways. You can focus on the eyes and have the nose out of focus. In this particular case, I really like that nose sort of to be sharp, and then the eyes at the back a little bit more out of focus. But it just shows you, I mean, even at f8, just how shallow that depth of field is, right? So in this particular case, if you wanted that whole face in focus, probably had to go down up to like maybe f16 even, just because you were so close. Okay. Okay, then you get the cheetahs. It's a beautiful, beautiful little family. And in this particular case, I really wanted to get as many of them in focus as possible, again, without sort of losing too much of the shutter speed. Here you can see there was a lot of light available. So an aperture of about 7.1 gave enough detail in all of them to be able to sort of achieve focus through the whole family. Again, in this particular case, if you had to choose a shallow depth of field, nothing wrong with it, but then your focal point really becomes crucial. So for the majority of the time, people often ask when you're faced with something like this, where would your focus be? And I'm going to get to that at a later stage. But in this particular case, my focus was on the mom standing up, and then with that depth of field, I managed to get the rest of the cubs in focus. You could also maybe have gone with a shallow depth of field, but then your eyes sort of lose a bit of interest, if you will, on the little cubs, which obviously they play such a massive part in this particular image. Okay, then obviously interaction, fantastic way to sort of show that that depth with f9. You can see all the vultures, even the vulture at the back behind the jackal is relatively in focus. But again, with something like this, you don't want to shoot at a very shallow depth of field, because then, I mean, if I shot this maybe at f4, f5, only my jackal would have been in focus, which is my focal point. just because he's the main character of the story almost. I'm focusing on him, and with F9, I get those vultures in the back in focus as well. So I think, from a creativity point of view, I think aperture and shutter speed are your most crucial elements to your frame, and definitely have to be the starting blocks before you decide to press that shutter, to know what it is you're trying to create and the different effects that you'll get. Okay, again, elephant coming really, really close. This was once again at Somalisa. And in order for me to get that whole trunk and the tusks in focus, you can see at the bottom there, aperture of f11. And this was only at 300 mils. So you can imagine if I was close at 600 mils, I would have had to increase that depth of field. And the reason for that being is just because, like I said, I wanted to get that whole trunk in focus, as well as the tusks. You can see the ears at the back to the left. That's starting to go out of focus. All right. So again, no right and wrong about this, but you have to sort of understand what you want to create. You can also, you can go with a shallow depth of field like f4 on the trunk, but that will then mean that those tusks will then be out of focus. Okay. I think you guys have probably seen a lot of the times like close-up photographs of elephants' eyes. Again, depending on what you want to create. I think a lot of the times in photographic safaris, we almost go for an overall sort of setting, if that makes sense. We all say, okay, shoot this at f8 or shoot this at f7.1, but don't let that stop you from being creative in your own way. Okay, so my idea behind this was to really just give you an idea of what you can do creatively, and then you sort of put your own spin on it. Okay, so I've looked at my scene. I've got my shutter speed. My shutter speed is fine. I'm happy with the aperture, the depth of field that I want to create in my frame. And then an important thing, and it might sound silly, but I've put in a focus on there. And the reason for that being is, on this particular safari, I helped Kim to use back button focus. Now, as I said before, this was the first time doing wildlife photography. So, and the only downside of using back button focusing is remembering to push that back button. Apart from that, there really is no downside to back button focusing. It is phenomenal. And I'm going to show you guys why I really love using it. So just to give you an idea, it's the AF on button. I'm not going to go through the whole sort of custom menu and how to get there. But if you guys would like help in getting your back button focus activated, send me an email. I'll leave my email down at the bottom at the end. And then you can feel free to send me an email and I'll assist you with that gladly. Okay, so when you look through the frame and you focus, there's usually like a red square on there. So, you can choose 1 point, you can choose 4, you can choose 6, you can choose as many as you like. For the majority of the time, I prefer to choose just one focal point. And then, if I'm photographing birds, especially if they're really, really small. So just think off the bat now, maybe something like carmine bee-eaters or your kingfishers. It is virtually almost impossible to use one focal point and track them all the way. So multiple focal points with them, keep it on them, and then track them all the way through. I'm going to be talking through that now. So take this scene, for example, and this is where back button focus comes in very handy. You see how people often talk about the rule of thirds, right? So this is, if you look at it, it's outside the rule of bottom thirds. And the reason for that being is I wanted to really include that sky, a beautiful storm building up in the Serengeti that I wanted to get in the frame. And back button focus allows you to do that. So with many of the cameras, you might not have a focal point. So if you move your focal point around that little red square, it might not get far enough down that you are able to include that big sky. So with back button focusing, what I would do is I would try and choose the focal point closest to that line, and move it down, push my back button, and then let go. And then you can recompose, move the image wherever you like. That line will stay in focus, and then just press the shutter button. Whereas, usually if you half press the shutter, if you then move it, you have to press it again, and it doesn't stay in focus. So back button focus, crucial for something like this. I love the way you can recompose. And also, I mean, if you want to, I won't say cheat, but if you want to speed up or be a little bit faster with this, you can even leave your focal point in the middle, move down, press your back button, recompose, and then press your shutter and create your image like this. So you don't have to move your focal point around. And that's the great thing with back button focusing. Obviously, when an animal moves, it becomes a little bit harder, and we'll be talking through that now. So when you get this, wild dogs playing or animals moving, what you simply do then is just keep your finger on the back button, and it will track your animal. So you've got to obviously keep, if you have your focal point in the middle, keep the focal point on the animal's face, keep your finger on the back button, and then just fire off your shutter whenever you feel like it. All right, so you can go from one shot to tracking an action scene just by pressing the back button, if that makes sense. If you guys have any questions on back button focusing, please feel free to shout, or about shutter speed or aperture, feel free to give me a shout, and I'll answer those questions as soon as we get a little bit closer to the end of this. Okay, then your focusing also becomes crucial, when you have multiple subjects. Like I mentioned with the other scene, I can't remember exactly what it was. Oh, with the cheetahs. Again, it's up to you as the photographer where you feel that your viewer's eye should go. Majority of the times, you want to focus on the subject that's closer to you, but not always. Just in this particular case, I felt this male, I wanted him in focus, and then with the shallow depth of field, just sort of blur the one in the back out, but not that much that you can't sort of tell what it is, if that makes sense. Okay, something like this, crucial where you put your focal point. You've got like a busy scene with legs and the little baby elephant between the adults at a waterhole. Vital then in this particular case, and then with the play of a shallow depth of field. So low F number, focus on the little elephant on the head, press your back button, and fire away. So choosing your focal point, crucial depending on the story that you want to tell. Okay, now, like for these types of scenes, I love this kind of photography. It's I think a lot of the time people are put off when they have a busy scene in front of them. I absolutely love it, and with back button focusing, it really does make it so much easier. Okay, so with this female leopard, again, with back button focusing, you can press your back button on the face or on the eyes, hit your back button, and then recompose however you like, and then press your shutter button. But it is vital that where you put your focal point in busy scenes like this. You'll find often your camera might struggle to focus a little bit just because of all those branches and things that are in the way. I find in a scenario like this, often your center focal point is often the most accurate when it comes to these busy scenes. If you choose your focal points far left or far right, they might struggle to achieve focus. Okay, and then exposure. So that's the last thing. So I've got checked my shutter speed, I've checked my aperture, I've focused. So now I can take the photo. But I think the mistake a lot of the time that people make is that they don't actually check the exposure. And what could go wrong in this particular scene is you could end up with a whole sequence of images, or a whole sighting of images being either too dark or too light. So it's vital, once you check everything, focus, press your shutter, and then have a look at your frame. I think also, that also it's going to depend from camera to camera and also lens to lens. I'm going to try and explain to you just briefly how your camera sort of susses a particular scene. So if your camera, so here's the meter below highlighted, that's your exposure meter. So majority of the time, if you leave that on 0, on that sort of center point, most of the time that will give you a fairly accurate exposure reading. What that means is your camera looks at the entire scene, right? So if you have if the majority of your scene is very dark, whether that be maybe from dark clouds or dark green vegetation, your camera is going to try and lighten your entire frame. Okay, your camera doesn't want an image that's over or underexposed. Your camera wants it to be evenly exposed. If the majority of your scene is dark, your camera is going to try and make it brighter. If the majority of your scene is bright, so think of maybe a white beach or snow, your camera is going to try and make that a little bit darker. But your camera doesn't know what subject you're photographing. Your camera just sees the entire scene. So let's take, for example, a lioness in a very dark background. So let's say lush green vegetation in the back. So the majority of the scene is dark. Your camera is going to try and make it lighter. Now, what happens to your lioness, who's already light? She also becomes bright and often then becomes overexposed. Right? I hope I'm making sense. If you then underexpose, so basically you're overriding what the camera's trying to do. Remember, the overall scene is dark. Your camera's going to try and make it brighter. What you basically say to the camera, if you underexpose, is I know that area is dark, but I've got a lioness here that's lighter than my background, and I want to expose for the lioness. So make that background even darker so you get the right exposure on your lioness. Does that make sense? The same thing happens, maybe, I don't know if I'm sure you guys must have photographed people on the beach before, right? If you photograph people on the beach, often if you're on auto, you'll take the photo and you'll see the beach looks great, but the people are very dark. And that's because the majority of that scene is very bright. Your camera is going to try and make it a little bit darker. Right? Now, your people that are already darker than the sand now, also become dark. So what you do is you overexpose to make that bright beach brighter, and maybe even completely overexpose that beach to be able to get enough detail in your people and in their faces. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Easy way to remember the exposure triangle, the metering modes is that right is bright and left is dark. So that's an easy way to remember it. So always, first take a photo with your with the settings that you have. Take a photo, have a look, and then have a look from an exposure point of view what you would like to do. If I'm with you in a vehicle and you're photographing with a 600mm lens and I've got a 200mm lens, our exposures might be different, right? I might have a lot of sky, which is very bright, which my camera is going to try and make a little bit darker. So I might have to overexpose. Whereas if you go in really close with the 600, you might have only dark vegetation. Your camera is going to try and make it lighter. You might have to underexpose. Okay, it can get a little bit confusing, but I'm going to try and show you a few examples here and hope that helps. So here's a particular scene, lioness, and you can see the exposure. My exposure meter is on 0. Okay, have a look what happens now if I go a third under. Okay, so from there to there, and I look at 2/3. See the difference there. So that's when the majority of the scene here, you can see the background is quite dark from the soil and also that bit of shade that was falling on the lioness. So your camera is going to try and make it a little bit lighter. Now that light part that's here on her shoulders and on her legs and also on the face, that will also get brightened. So often that will get overexposed, yeah, which you don't want. So a lot of the time you're exposing, it doesn't matter if you lose detail on that background. It's not about that background. That background, there's nothing pretty to it. You want to focus on that lioness and sort of try and expose for those sort of bright areas on her. Okay, beautiful tiger in Kanha in India. And again, look at the majority of the scene. Majority of the scene, very, very dark, lush green vegetation in that jungle. your camera is going to try and make that a little bit lighter. So what happens to your tiger that's already lighter than your background? It becomes overexposed. So in this case, you can see I've underexposed. And this sort of comes, people often ask, how do you know how much to underexpose? And it's almost impossible to get to a scene and say, okay, for this particular scene, you need to go 1 1/3 under. What I would usually do, take a photo at 0, as I mentioned, and then see, okay, that's a little bit, that's too bright. Then maybe go 1/3 under, take a photo again. Oh, that's still a bit too bright. Then maybe go 2/3 or full stop, take a photo and have a look. Till you get to that happy sort of place, and then you can fire away, you can photograph your scene. Very important to remember though, if this animal gets up and moves to a brighter area, you need to be mindful of that because now your exposure is going to change again. Okay, another beautiful male lion, dark vegetation during the green season. Camera sees it as being very dark, tries to make it a little bit lighter. Your line, especially in the face and the mane, becomes too bright, becomes overexposed. So you're basically underexposing, so minus 1/3. It's just the first dot to the left. That then gives you a nice sort of dark background, and also your line is correctly exposed. Okay, big elephant in Chobe. If you've been to the Chobe, you'll know there's like a lot of white beach sand, also bright skies. This was in October, so no rain to speak of whatsoever. The majority of the scene is very, very bright. Your camera's going to try and make that darker, which means I will lose detail in my elephants, which I don't want. So I saw what the camera was trying to do, and then went override it, make those bright areas even brighter to be able to get detail on the elephant. You can even see on that trunk, you've got a bit of textures there as well, which is great. Okay, then sometimes you have to, you've got the best of both worlds, which is a good problem to have. You might have beautiful golden light, and you might have a fantastic subject as well. You then basically have to decide what is more important for you. So let's ask you guys, if you were presented with this particular scene and maybe an elephant had to walk behind this tree, what are you going to expose for? You're going to expose for your elephant or the sky? So remember, your camera sees the majority of the scene here. It's quite bright, right? Your camera is going to try and make it a little bit darker. You then lose detail in your elephant. Okay, so your elephant's going to be like a silhouette. But if you expose for your elephant, you're going to have to go brighter. You lose that golden light that you have in the back there. Okay, so sometimes you have to choose what you expose for. And again, there's no right or wrong in this particular scenario. For me personally, I wish I had an elephant in the scene. It didn't happen, unfortunately, but I would 100% expose for that light to get that beautiful golden light, and hope that my subject, elephant in this case, walks sort of side on. And the reason why you want that side on profile is then you have those identifiable features. You can still see, even though there's no detail in the elephant, you can still see it's an elephant from its overall shape. Okay. If an elephant was walking towards you or away from you, it would just be like a big black blob. You won't be able to tell what it is. So vital that if you're going to go in this particular route, if you're faced with this scene, you're going to underexpose. So make it darker, so you expose for that sky. The sky is not too bright, and you also get those beautiful golden colors. But then also look for those identifiable features. If you get an elephant with its trunk up, you've basically struck gold. Okay. Another case of a lion in the Masai Mara. Beautiful place to photograph these silhouette images. Again, it depends what you want to get from this particular scene. If you wanted to get detail in the lion, you have to sort of overexpose, but that means that you will lose the color in your sky, and the sky will become very, very bright, but then at least you'll have detail in your line. For me, with sunsets, and probably about like 95% of my thought processes when it comes to a scene like this, I will underexpose, expose for that sky, get those beautiful orange, golden colors. But then because my line is up, you can see that's a male lion because of that mane that's up and that side-on profile. If he was facing me or if he had his back towards me again, no, probably wouldn't be able to tell what it is. It would just be a black blob. And remember, it's about what you want to create in a particular scene. I hope that, you know, just by giving you guys some of these tricks, some of these tips to remember, sort of give yourself a sort of tick list to go through. And that will help you from a photographic point of view, that not much will go wrong. And I hope that it also gives you some creative ideas now to create the images that you want to create. You know, I think a lot of the time we create images because, you know, that's what I might say in the vehicle, you know, shoot this or shoot that. But it's still, you still have to have your own creative spin on it. And that's why if you guys come on Safari, again, not too long from now, it's not going to be long, to keep these things in mind. So you can bank your shots, get your safe shots, but also then put a bit of a creative spin on it. Yeah, I just want to see, I think there's a few questions. Do you recommend to make photocopies in Jpeg from the RAW? I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Is it Iago? I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Yes, I would always shoot in RAW format, just because you've got so much information, then your files are a bit bigger then. But sort of when you then process your image, there's a lot of information that you can then use to maybe just to lift some of the shadows, enhance some of the colors. Remember also, you know, when you're processing images, a lot of people see it as cheating and things like that. You're not taking out a ugly tree and putting a rainbow behind it. You're just enhancing some colors, lifting some of the shadows and things. But it's very important to get it right in camera as much as you possibly can. Sometimes you can't get it 100% correct, and all of these images have been processed in some way or another. But like I mentioned, it's just enhancing colors, making some areas maybe a little bit darker than others, and also just general sharpening. So I hope that answers your question. Path asked, what was the ISO for the elephant image in which your shutter speed was about 5 seconds? I'll have to have a look for you. If I remember correctly, I think it would have been quite high. I think it was about maybe around about the 3,200 mark. Usually, if I'm photographing stars and night sky like that, ISO of about 2,500, 3,200 even, and then a shutter speed of like 25 to 30 seconds to be able to get that Milky Way. So because this was only open for 5 seconds, you know, you didn't really get that Milky Way effect. But if I had to leave it open for 30 seconds, there probably wouldn't have been much of my elephant there. So you had to get that sort of happy medium almost, if you will. Okay. Let's see other questions. Oh yeah. Is Lightroom capable of handling the noise induced for high ISO? 100%. Path, yeah. I mean, we've done a few webinars. I think Gerry's done one about general sharpening and noise reduction in Lightroom. There is a noise reduction slider, but there's also, you can also bring down noise in your radial filter and also adjustment brush. So yeah, absolutely. I think also, you know, we make too much of a fuss about high ISOs a lot of the time. You know, I think I said it in my last webinar as well. Most of the people that go out and do wildlife images post on Instagram. Now, if you look at how big the images are viewed on Instagram, I can guarantee you now I can shoot a photo at 8,000 ISO and put it on Instagram, and you probably won't even see the noise. So if you're printing really, really big, maybe it's a bit of a concern, but it also depends what you print on. I've often found if you're printing on canvas, then having a bit of noise really has quite a cool effect, actually. So I would always rather push my ISO too high and maybe deal with a bit of noise than have an image that is blurred just because I didn't have a fast enough shutter speed. Lindsay said was going to ask about back button focusing. Yeah, Lindsay, I mean, if you guys have any questions regarding back button focusing, I'm happy to assist. I'm going to leave this open for a few minutes just to see if there's any more questions. I hope that that has helped you guys a little bit. It's a short and sweet one, but it's definitely, I mean, it's like what really satisfied me after this was just to see how it helped Kim with her photography. So every time before she took an image, she said, okay, save, shutter speed, aperture, focus, take the photo, check the exposure, and deal with it from there. Guys, you can't go wrong if you adopt this. And I think it's a pretty easy way to remember it. Let's just see if there's any more questions. Thanks, Linda. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you. Okay, sorry, one more question. Would it not be better to choose aperture before shutter speed? Jan, I think for me the first thing is to check. You know, first of all, if I want to freeze or blur my image, and I think this was. You probably could check your aperture first, but I always sort of think first: do I want to freeze it or do I want to blur it? If you sort of increase your depth of field, then yes, you do have to look at your shutter speed again. So if, for example, you put your camera down and you put it back on again, you've got a scene and you're at f4 and you want to go to f10, yes, you do have to sort of keep your eye back on your shutter speed again to make sure it hasn't gone too low. But the safe mode, I just find a better way to sort of explain and teach to my clients out in the field, which, like I mentioned, really has worked very well so far. But yeah, I mean, it's up to you. You could swap A and S around, and you can create your own word. All right, thank you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate all this feedback, and look forward to hearing from you guys. If you have any questions or want to direct it to me directly, or send it to me directly, my email is Johan, so JOHAN @wild-eye.co.za. Johan @wild-eye.co.za. I look forward to answering any of your questions. Or if there's anything in particular that you would like for us to discuss in future webinars, feel free to let us know. We're happy to assist you guys and help you with your photographic journey. Yeah, that's it from my side. I will catch you guys hopefully next week. I think next week, Wednesday is my next one. Look forward to seeing you all there. Till next time, cheers.